The war was supposed to be over. Humanity had fallen. But one man remained, standing alone against the darkness, refusing to surrender. His fight was far from finished. The battle was just beginning. The darkness had consumed the world. Once a vibrant planet, Earth now lay in ruins, her cities crumbled, her forests burned to ash, and her oceans poisoned by the remnants of humanity's own war. The war that had brought Earth to its knees had begun so innocently, with small conflicts that no one could have predicted would spiral out of control. Then, a single faction, fueled by an insatiable desire for power, unleashed a weapon so devastating that the very fabric of civilization was torn apart. The world had descended into chaos, into a war that no one had wanted, but that no one could stop. At first, there were many voices, many soldiers fighting for survival, for the future of humanity. The world's great leaders, military commanders, and civilians alike gave everything to try and end the war. But as the years passed, hope slowly faded. Humanity had begun to lose its will to fight. The weapons of mass destruction had torn apart not just cities, but the very soul of the human race. The skies grew dark with smoke, the air became toxic, and the Earth's surface had become a battlefield, littered with the corpses of fallen warriors. Civilization collapsed, and with it, the will to continue the fight. In the final days of the war, it seemed as though humanity had already lost. The armies were defeated. The leaders were gone. The cities had crumbled, and the few survivors were scattered across the desolate wasteland, living in hiding, trying to survive against all odds. The world was a graveyard. The war had ended, but it had taken everything. There was no future, only the bitter remnants of a once thriving planet. And yet, amid the ruins, amid the silence that had taken over the world, there was one human left. One person who had refused to surrender. The rest of humanity might have fallen, but not him. He had seen the death of his friends, his family, his comrades. He had seen the rise of the enemy that had torn everything apart, and he had fought with everything he had. But unlike the others, he had never given up. He had never lost his will to keep going. His name was Captain Alexander Hayes, and he was the last of his kind. The last soldier who stood, not because he had to, but because he couldn't live with the idea of giving up. The war might have taken everything, but it hadn't taken his spirit. It hadn't taken his need for justice. It hadn't taken his need to see his people avenged, to see the world restored, no matter the cost. For years, Captain Hayes had wandered the wasteland, watching the ruins of his once great civilization fade into history. He fought against the remnants of the enemy, scavenging whatever he could to survive. He had become a shadow of what he once was, a man stripped of his purpose but still alive, still breathing. And it was that very survival, that drive to keep going when everyone else had fallen, that made him dangerous. The world believed the war was over. The enemy had claimed victory, or so they thought. They believed humanity had been wiped out, that there was no one left to fight, no one left to oppose them. The military records had all but confirmed it. Scans of the Earth's surface showed no more active human life. Humanity had gone silent. There were no more rebellions, no more uprisings. The enemy had secured their hold, and the war seemed like a distant memory. But in the heart of that darkness, Captain Hayes stood. He wasn't much to look at. His uniform was tattered, his armor scratched and worn, and his face was unshaven, rough from years of wandering the wastelands. But what remained in him was the fire that had once made him a soldier. And now, it burned more fiercely than ever. The first sign that something had changed was a small signal. A faint pulse of communication that broke through the static, a call for help that had not been sent in years. It wasn't a message from another human, but it was enough to stir the embers of hope in Captain Hayes' heart. Someone, somewhere, still cared enough to send a signal. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that he could not let the war end like this. Not without a fight. He set off toward the source of the signal, a location far to the north, beyond the territories controlled by the enemy. It was dangerous, but that was nothing new to him. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had survived. This would be no different. The journey was long and treacherous, the landscape littered with the remnants of battles fought long ago. But with every step, his resolve grew stronger. The thought of a future, of a world that could rise from the ashes of destruction, kept him going. As he moved through the desolate terrain, he encountered remnants of the enemy. Stragglers who had once been soldiers, but who now wandered aimlessly, without purpose, without direction. They had lost their cause, their reason to fight. They had no more orders, no more goals. They were like the rest of humanity, lost. Captain Hayes fought them without hesitation, each victory a reminder that he was still standing, still capable of doing what needed to be done. Eventually, he arrived at the source of the signal, a hidden underground bunker, buried deep beneath the surface. Inside, he found a surprising sight. A group of survivors, huddled together in a small, makeshift colony, living in isolation. They were the last remnants of humanity, people who had survived the fall, but who had given up all hope of ever rebuilding. The survivors had heard the stories. They had seen the fall of the world and had accepted their fate. They believed the war was over. But Captain Hayes wasn't ready to accept that. He wasn't ready to let everything they had fought for be forgotten. "I thought you were all gone," one of the survivors said when he saw Hayes. "We're not gone," Hayes replied, his voice firm. "And neither is Earth. Not yet." The survivors were skeptical at first, but Hayes' presence was enough to reignite a spark of hope in them. He shared his plan with them, his plan to fight back, to rally whatever resources they could and make one last stand. It would be dangerous. It would be impossible. But it was the only chance they had. The enemy thought the war was over, but they were wrong. As long as Captain Hayes stood, the war was not over. Together, they worked in secret, preparing for a battle that no one believed could be won. They scoured the remains of the world for weapons, for supplies, for anything that could be used to fight back. And through it all, Hayes remained the unbreakable force, the one who refused to back down, who refused to accept defeat. The war had taken everything from him, but it would never take his will to fight. When the time came, the survivors stood together, not as broken people hiding in fear, but as a united force, ready to take on the enemy once more. Captain Hayes led them, not as a commander, but as a symbol of what humanity had lost and what they still had left to fight for. The battle was fierce, but it was only the beginning. The war was far from over. And as long as Captain Hayes stood, as long as one human remained, the fight would continue. The world thought the war was over. They thought they had won. But the truth was simple: as long as there was one human left, the fight was far from finished. And Captain Hayes had made sure they would remember that.